why is it important to have a deaf and hearing team? Many times there are people who are from a different country. They might be using a different language, so we'll bring in a CDI to help with that situation. Or it could be a person who was deaf and they were born in America who maybe didn't have a lot of communication access growing up, so there's a lot of gesturing happening. So that's another reason for a CDI. Physical disabilities could be another contributing factor. Maybe their hands don't have the normal dexterity due to age. Could be that their finger spelling is really the main thing impacted, but their signs are fine. So maybe they aren't able to move or they have limited movement, so that could be a reason CDI would be brought in. I remember one time here in the Milwaukee area, there was one deaf man, and I think it was on his right hand, he was missing most of his fingers. Do you remember that? I think it was all the way, yeah, a good majority of his fingers were gone. So he was signing, but it was really tough to understand. I mean, if you were used to signing, you could get it, but if it was, in a legal environment, it was, I would definitely want a CDI to be brought in. So he was a nice man, that's off point, but that's another situation.
So did that, related to what that man, did you have the opportunity to work with him before that happened?
Oh, no, I didn't work with him in court, no.
Oh, okay.
I just know him from the community, but I never worked with him personally.
So is it possible in court that you would bring in the CDI then? Meaning the two of you maybe would work with him and analyze his signing before, so you could become comfortable with his signing before the court date?
Typically, if I don't know who the consumer is, I mean, I typically know who they are, but I'll always have a check-in period where I can sit down with them and get used to their language. It won't be related to the situation, it'll just be random topics so the two of us can get to know each other's signing styles. Typically 1 minute it's a language screening, and I can usually figure it out within 1 minute. I can figure out what their level of signing is, how much they understand, how much I can understand. So that gives me a little bit of time to know what to expect.
Do you always have a screening? Like with each new person that you deal with, do you screen them? So is it required or is that your decision?
I mean, I want to too. You know, it helps me improve my skills. So it really works to my advantage to sit down with them and chat with them for a few minutes before we go into the situation. It makes my interpretation better. I don't want to walk into the situation and have a lot of communication breakdowns or, that 5 or 10 minutes where it's really awkward until I can actually understand them. So I use the screening to my benefit. Yep. Maybe the consumer is deaf-blind or low vision. That's another situation when we bring in a CDI. Because then the two consumers will then have access to their native language. So CDIs will very often be used for deaf-blind or low vision consumers. There's a huge community of deaf-blind and low vision consumers. Gallaudet has many deaf-blind consumers as well, right? Yep. tactile sign language. It's really tough to work with that. Some of you have maybe seen this concept of tactile signing on the back. That's a newer type of style that's called pro-tactile. I think it was developed in Sweden. Started in the 1990s and it kind of infiltrated to the US, but we were a little bit resistant to it. And then I think a few years ago it really made its way over to the US and we started using it. Mental health, it's so important to have a CDI. So many of you people who are caring, you know when a person is like walking around and they're talking to someone else, they're talking to themselves. I mean, how do you know that that's happening? Maybe they're having a conversation with 2 or 3 different people. How do you know that that's happening?
I'm sorry. So sometimes they change their voice. They'll change maybe to a high or a low pitch. So the fluctuation in the voice shows that.
Yeah, right. So their vocal intonation changes and you can kind of hear it and notice that it's happening. Deaf have that same thing. They maybe change the way they're signing just a little bit. I mean, you guys probably wouldn't notice it. But the same way that you would hear that change in the voice, we would see it in the signs. So you can that happens. It really happens. Do you remember your first mental health experience? First time I went in and I experienced a mental health appointment, I was in a mental health ward. So I entered, I was looking around. I mean, it was interesting. I was kind of picking up on everything. So I met the deaf person. The deaf person was kind of bending over, signing towards the ground. I think I asked Cindy what to do. Should we go down there? Okay. So I decided that I needed to see what they were signing. I was trying to interpret. It was maybe 5 minutes or so, and I needed to just stop. I mean, the person was just in another world. They were going on and on and on, and I was signing and interpreting, and there's a lot of different names popping up. So I was telling the person who I was interpreting to that they were just changing the names. So it was maybe 10 or 15 minutes just explaining who these people were. I don't know if it was like an hour or something this went on. And after the appointment, he was commenting. He's like, that's mental health. I was like, I did not like it. It's fun. It's fun. I'm sure he can tell you that mental health, like, it's serious. So typically people who go through legal situations have a connection with mental health. There's a lot of overlap between the 2 areas. Mental health situations, that signing style is not easy for me to understand. I mean, really,
So the structure of the language can completely change. It can be very difficult to comprehend. So they'll lose their facial expression, they'll lose their grammar or their role shifting, and it'll just be signs.
so I think it's really difficult for the hearing interpreter to then pick up on that. So I think that's important to the guys. So I just want to add a little bit more relating to mental health. I think I was one of the first people in Wisconsin to go out to the training in Alabama relating to mental health. My training was 2 weeks, and right now it's only 1 week. So it was 1 week of training, and then I had 1 week at an internship. So when I came back from the internship, the internship took place in a mental health ward. It used to be that way, not any longer. There was one woman there, she was in the hall, and I noticed her. She was just kind of standing there scratching her body. So I didn't take much notice to it. And later they had a meeting with the doctor and the psychologist. And I came in to interpret, and they were asking her about how she felt on her medication. If she was maybe experiencing any side effects. One of the side effects was that she would start itching, or she felt like there were bugs on her. So I asked her, did you notice any, itching feelings? Maybe on your legs, arms, anywhere on your body? She denied it. She said she didn't have that side effect. She didn't feel like there were any bugs on her. She wasn't scratching, nothing. So the meeting kept on going, and I was really stuck on this concept because I had seen her scratching. It was a team environment, so, I asked if we could ask again about the scratching. Maybe a little bit more specific, because I had saw her, and I let her know I saw her, and she's like, oh yeah, it's awful.
That was a moment I will never forget. Because, just because of my mistake in the interpretation, that could have impacted her forever.
So it's like the difference between weapon and stab. How you interpret something can really impact the interpretation. So that was a really big thing for me to remember going forward. Minimal sign language is kind of a little bit related to the concept of someone being from a foreign country. They could be a really smart person in their native language, but when they're coming into America and they're speaking a different language, it impacts their language fluidity. It's important for interpreters to understand that when they come into appointment, it could be really tough to understand the deaf person. And never blame the deaf person. You need to blame yourself first. That's the attitude to have. The attitude of a good interpreter is to blame yourself first. Take a look at yourself. So anytime you're struggling to understand something, it doesn't matter whatever the reason is, but if you are struggling, make sure to bring in a CDI. Even if you feel like you're fine, bring in a CDI, they can kind of come in and, supervise and make sure that everything's clear. Some deaf people will not quote Spanish. Their natural language. So I feel bad for you here. But, that's another good reason, another good benefit for bringing in a CDI. As a deaf person, I'm not going to repeat for you if you don't understand, then, you need to do something to make sure it's clear. Either they're supporting you or they're clarifying, it doesn't matter.
Another example of what to use a CDI is someone who's having a mental break. Maybe they're on drugs or alcohol, and they're not connected with reality. That's definitely a benefit to have a CDI.
Can you imagine? That'd probably be really fun.
Did you have something to say?
Have you had an experience with maybe where you brought in a CDI, but then you felt like,
Yeah.
so you were going into the situation, really you didn't need the CDI, but a CDI was brought in?
I think there maybe been a few times where they didn't need it. Maybe there might have been a little bit of confusion about putting down the names because the names were the same. But there's a variety of different skill levels. And sometimes there's some amazing interpreters. And sometimes there's people that are really struggling. So it's good to have the expertise to work with that. There's some people who are struggling, they say, I need a CDI. And there are other times when I know they don't need me to communicate. So it really depends.
So maybe the group of interpreters that maybe have moderate skills, when you're down to situations, you let them know, like, hey, you didn't really need a CDI, or maybe you're a little bit nicer and say, well, maybe you should improve your skills. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. So specific, I mean, with that situation where someone needs, I mean, not necessarily needs, but we'll put that down. Like specifically, this person needs a clarifier, so I'll be there to facilitate that communication. So sometimes I'll be used in those situations as a clarifier. But it's always important that you're making sure to check up, especially if it's so maybe there could be a difference between a checkup versus a surgery. For example, that situation in a court system, that's definitely something related to legal concepts. It's definitely where you would want to have a CDI. I think related to the identifying someone if they need a CDI or don't need a CDI, that could be a whole other workshop. I mean, we could develop a list of identifying cues. Because before, when Lisa was a full-time interpreter, she would be traveling around everywhere. She would do a lot of traveling in northern Wisconsin, and the two of us would be discussing all of these different things, like when do we need a CDI for this person versus not for this person.
I used to have a reputation for always wanting to have a CDI.
And I think sometimes it's related to having a new interpreter, because their focus is a little more narrow. It's right on the person, but it needs to be focused on themselves, on my signing and my skills. What am I doing as an interpreter, and how am I understanding it? Will I be able to understand the deaf person? So I feel like the CDI is not necessarily on the deaf person, it's more of an interpreter focus. Am I skilled in the language, and will I be able to understand and analyze this deaf consumer's language? And if I feel like there's something where I'm not understanding their language, that is a good opportunity to ask them more questions and maybe bring in a CDI. So that's kind of the issue.
Kind of a hot topic type question. So suppose an agency labels this person as needing a CDI or whatever. Do you think some interpreters will choose to go ahead and do it without the CDI? So some hearing interpreters think that they always need the CDI. I don't know if that makes sense. I think I'm getting. I think I'm understanding. Here. We can understand you. So this person specifically may or not need the CDI, less or more. So let's say there's the political interpreting office, or an interpreter office inside the hospital. So how come at the other appointment, or so let's example, why would they use a CDI in one appointment but not use a CDI in the next appointment? So that can be a headache. So that's why we always try to stick with 2 interpreters. It keeps it easy. So let's say one interpreter is very skilled and they don't need a support interpreter. Well, what happens if that very skilled interpreter faces a conflict? Then are you going to have to send another interpreter in there who is kind of skilled and is going to be struggling with the situation? What would you do with that? So it really comes back to politics. It's all the politics of interpreting. So if 2 interpreters are always showing up and there's someone there to clarify, then it can go on smoothly, something like that. Is that what you were asking? Yeah, exactly. He's just a champ. I think I need to see that.
Package deal.
So let's say you're going out in the community and you're working. Your work with one deaf person is going to influence the work of other interpreters when they face with that job. I have had many arguments with people about why I have such a strong feeling about having, or opinion about having a CDI. Because many people have told me that they do not need a CDI. And even though I know that they might need a CDI, and I might disagree with that, I feel like, working with a CDI is still a new situation. It's a new introduction into the interpreting world, and it's basically a war of being able to accept having a CDI and accept the benefits of having one. So really, I feel like the best interpreters are people that ask for CDIs. Do you guys agree with that, or?
Amen.
Amen.
I think this question's more related to Sandy, but I guess it could work for both of you. So you've both been working for quite some time now. Do you feel like other interpreters might judge you if you choose to work with a CDI? Do you think people kind of look down on you or view you differently if you use a CDI, and how that relates to your attitude?
Sorry.
You have to be careful how you interpret this. I think when the day is done, I have to be responsible for myself. And I'm responsible for my life. And if I believe that this person needs a CDI, well, then I want a CDI. I think that's it. I don't think it hurts my reputation that I believe that someone needs a CDI. really, what I think the point is that you wanna be able to provide the best service for this person. And the goal is to provide the best facilitation for this person. So if someone's looking down on you because you wanna provide that service, that's their problem. Are they following the CPC?
Okay.
And I think that will hurt them in the long run. So I think we're done with this